check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Sherrills, and I'm so honored today to be the discussion leader for this important dialogue about discussing the hard realities of policing reform, building safe and just communities. I grew up in the Jordan housing projects in LA. I participated in many social justice activists called the longest running war in the history of this country, of the US. It's urban street gang wars. I lost many friends and family members, including my own son, to violence in the streets. But all of those things, I see as fuel, for this important dialogue and conversation that we have to engage as people. As we begin to redefine public safety in this country, traditionally, you say public safety and people say police. It was a domain that was owned by law enforcement. And the reality is that police are only one aspect of the public safety process. You literally cannot have public safety without the public, right? Public safety is not just the absence of violence and crime in communities. It's also the presence of well-being and the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey. I mean, I woke up this morning, honestly, with a really heavy heart. We have so much, further to go. I mean, we're literally at an inflection point in this country in terms of public safety. Never again should law enforcement be considered a single point of contact for safety in our respective community. Law enforcement is only one aspect of the public safety process. We have to develop complementary strategies to policing that haven't been invested in. I've been doing this work for some 30 years. For the past 7 years, I've been working in the city of Newark. I was tapped by the mayor in 2014 to build out his complementary strategy to policing in the city. Newark was a city that was on the top 10 most violent city list for almost 50 consecutive years. But since we've instituted our program, the Newark Community Street Team, we've had now 6 consecutive years in a row of decreases of homicide and overall violence. In 2019, we had a 60-year low. We had 51 murders in the city, which is 51 too many. But even during the pandemic, as violence spiked all across the country, we held that number to 51. And this is because we have a coordinated strategy. We train residents in neighborhoods as public safety professionals. They utilize their relationships to intervene and mediate conflicts to a peaceful outcome. This is extremely important, to understand, because we've been sold this idea, right, that and especially in the Black community, this false narrative, right, around Black on Black crime, as if Black people are responsible for their own safety in a country where we invest billions of dollars. Black people invest billions of dollars in public safety infrastructure. But it's because of white supremacy and white nationalism that's been embedded in policing. The history of policing in the US grew out of the Fugitive Slave Act, right? And for years, we've struggled, as community members, working with the criminal legal system in which our loved ones are murdered. As I said, I lost my son to the streets. My son's case has been a cold case for 15 years. And maybe because I was Black, maybe because I didn't share law enforcement frame around what justice is, that there was no real investigation, on apprehending the perpetrator, of that violent act against my son and my family, right? But, we persist, because every day I live, is to ensure that his life is valuable, and that those who grow up in these neighborhoods understand that violence is a public health issue. And that if we understand violence as a disease and we're going to work through the public health frame, that we're going to make sure that those who are closest in proximity have the resources, the skills, the tools necessary to intervene and to prevent and to treat, this disease that we call violence, right? I want to celebrate, the members of the Newark Community Street Team. I want to celebrate the mayor, Ras J. Baraka, the most progressive mayor in the country, for his stance. Because if you don't have the politics, the people, the paperwork, if you don't have those things all in alignment, it makes it really difficult to be able to shift, the public safety narrative in any respective community. Our goal is to change the public safety narrative in this country and globally that says that people, in neighborhoods, in communities where they live, have to be engaged in the public safety process. And we have to own it, so that we actually have the ability to create real safety. But the question is, what is the most important lesson you've learned working with police reform and building safe and just communities? And so let's start with you, Debbie.
Thank you, Akila. And like everyone else, can I just say it's a real privilege to be here today. I actually think the timing of this is amazing. But let me start by saying we're 20 years into a policing reform programme. And today, as I sit here with you and watching what I watched last night on television, even in our jurisdiction, I'm continually amazed by the lack of emotional and cultural sensitivity shown by our police service. And that's with a reform programme of 20 years. So I suppose, Akila, one of the biggest lessons that I have learned is you can never take your foot off the pedal. And if you do, things will roll backwards. So this is a continual fight for justice. We started our reform programme about 23 years ago. Most of you will know of the Troubles, and we had the signing of the Good Friday Agreement 23 years ago. And policing was always a contested space in this jurisdiction. It was always difficult because the police, there was a perception and a reality that the police belonged to one side of the community, the Protestant side of the community, and not to the Catholic side of the community. In reality, it felt more to me like a class issue. So if you lived in a poor, socially disadvantaged community, you were very disenfranchised, disconnected, and marginalised from the whole public health debate, public safety debate, and the policing debate. And I think that probably resonates with everyone here. It tends to be more of a class issue than anything else. We had a policing reform programme, and some of you may know, and I don't want you to laugh at this, but out of our policing reform programme, we had just a mere 175 recommendations. Oh my God, 175. That's how much reform needed to take place. And I suppose looking back, we should have asked the question, were all of those really necessary? And what are the priority ones that we needed to implement immediately? But let me share with you, I think, the 2 or 3 key aspects of policing reform. And I hope that this, it brings it to life for you. So our policing reform programme, we're still on that journey, but the key thing was all of the reforms were enshrined in legislation. So unless you attach money to it, unless you measure it, unless you enshrine it in legislation, it does not get done. So that is one of the key pieces of learning for us. Secondly, there was political will to make this happen. So there was a party within the Republican community, Sinn Féin, that really pushed this forward. Unless there's political will, unless it's enshrined in legislation, it's not going to happen, folks. So those were the 2 things that gave us the leverage, that gave us the weight and the teeth to do business. The third thing was, when you talk about policing reform, don't look at it just through the lens of policing. So we changed the whole policing architecture. So the 3 bodies that now make up the policing architecture are the police service, and we don't use the word force anymore because the police are there to serve the community. Language is really important. Martin talked about the police authority, which I was on for 10 years, and it nearly killed me, folks. but it was worth it. So the policing accountability body that holds the police authority, that holds the police to account, and then the complaints body. So members of the public don't take their complaints to the police. They don't take their complaints to one person, the mayor. They take their complaints to a completely independent body that has no political affiliation whatsoever. So those three bodies made up the policing architecture, the new policing architecture. A quote, which is a Peelian principle, and Robert Peel was the founding father of the whole police service in the UK. And regardless of what you think of Robert Peel, one of his key principles way back in the 1800s was police at all times should maintain a relationship with the public that gives reality to the tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. Think about that, and think about what that should look and feel like when it's brought to life. I often say to the police, policing does not belong to you. Policing belongs to all of us. And it's an endeavour that we all should be fighting for, to ensure that our communities, and especially our most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities, have a stake in.
Thank you, Debbie, for the profound work that you have done. I want to go ahead and move to Zelda Holtzman to share.
As some of you might know, the issue of policing and policing outcomes have always been part of the nature of my work. It's a path that I've traveled with great enthusiasm, but also with great disappointment. And I want to hopefully just bring out why that is. But I want to start with sort of, where do we start this conversation about public safety? There's a tendency, a general orientation, a proclivity to start that with the police, because of assumption that the police equals public safety. And then when it doesn't, because there's some breaches of the protocols and we have deaths on the street, then it's referred to by establishment, by the police and police aficionados, inevitably elements of the state and the judiciary, as the rotten apple syndrome. It's the rotten apple. Let us have an inquiry. Let us have a commission of inquiry because it's untoward, it's not natural. So when 40 people are mowed down by the police in Marikana and workers are killed, we still call that a rotten apple syndrome when 40 people are dead. If the protesting students are shot at and some person ends up dead on the street, is that also a rotten apple syndrome? And if protesters, communities are protesting, demanding basic services, access to sanitation, water, housing, and the police open fire on them, then we say it's a rotten apple syndrome. But I would put out and assert that it is a rotten system syndrome that we're dealing with. But also that there shouldn't be surprises that the system is rotten. If we go back to the historiography, the history of the system, then a shared history that some of us in our locales, in our countries, in our settings, share as a common denominator, and that is a common colonizer that brought with it instruments of power and control, one of which is the police. Whatever its form and its nature or variations thereof, the police was an instrument of control to protect a colonial order and also the profits and the loot of that conquest. So it is an instrument that essentially is geared towards protecting property and people with property, and particularly property that's come by through theft and loot in the process of colonial conquest. And if we start a conversation with what do people need, then we probably might come up with a different answer, and certainly wouldn't be one that would speak to a militarized police armed to the teeth that identify the enemy in the colonial construct that happen to be poor, that happen to be workers, that happen to be Black people, that happen to be all those that are other than those who have property and have privilege. So we're often surprised when there is this, what is referred to as rotten apples. No, it is a system. It's a rotten system that would have that as an outcome, and we'll go from one commission to the next commission looking at why police react in a violent manner when it's a violent instrument turned to what is then considered the enemy. So I think it's important for us to look at how the conversation is framed and what it would take to look at it through different lenses as what the needs of the community would be and what would guarantee and where the guarantors for the needs of safety would be. And I don't think that our default generally is towards reforms, and we change the name and we change the symbols, but fundamentally we don't change the orientation. So unless we deconstruct and decolonize, we probably would have another Marikana, another Floyd, another Tekana, etc., and all we engaging is mobilizing around that incident as if it is outside of a general consequence of the nature of this instrument of violence that we expect to bring about peace, when in fact it is linked to the manifestation of further violence.
Thank you so much, Zelda. Such a profound, way in which you frame the policing as an instrument of power and control to protect the colonial order. I think that Americans we're so like myopic in our view of what's happening, in the world. We think that everything evolves around us and don't really understand like kind of how colonization has impacted, the entire world. And so, I mean, just profound work. Thank you so much for what you do. And I want to next introduce Susan Lee.
Something I learned doing this work, and for most of 2020, I learned the importance of community and the mental wellness to do the actual work. That brought me back to a time where myself and a group of my friends went to the protests for George Floyd last summer. Very peaceful, one of the biggest turnouts, and I've been protesting for the last 10 years of my life. So, 2020 just had a different feel in the atmosphere, where the young organizers in charge of, or the creators of Black Boston 2020, at the end of the march, they mentioned, the march has ended and the police will do what the police do, look out for one another. Literally, as that statement was mentioned and we were all making our way home, I looked to my left and saw a police cruiser rush into a crowd of young people trying to go home, witnessing a young man trying to take the subway home, but it was blocked off, and saw a police officer take out their baton and beat on this young man for trying to go home. Just from that point on, and now like a year later, going into this space, I think a lot of the community has felt a lot of defeat, seeing Black and brown bodies being killed in broad daylight, seeing it in our own backyards. I come from a neighborhood that's gang affiliated. We see and hear a lot of things, but it still doesn't desensitize us from witnessing it on social media or on the news. So me being in this role for a little over a year now, regardless of the organizing work that I do have, fighting for police reform means clocking in 9 to 5 and then logging off to still face those same injustices. And all of that has taught me, even though we have our community, we also have to look out for our own mental health to continuously log back on in, as Debbie mentioned, put our foot on the gas so we can keep doing the work. In spite of that, so for the actual police reform that has happened in Massachusetts, it was a long fight where our formal legislative process typically ends, or the bill cycle ends on July 31st. And that's when we thought we would hear some type of victory for police reform in Boston or in Massachusetts. But it was a long fight and we didn't get anything passed until New Year's Eve. A big part of the police reform bill, I believe it was over 170 pages. It covered wide range of police accountability training, and a big part that UTEC and TLTW, which is Teens Leading the Way, had a part of was expungement for juveniles. About 10 years ago was when expungement was introduced to legislation in regards to fighting for it for young people. We didn't realize there wasn't any law for juveniles to receive expungement for their records. It's just sealing, and expungement was only offered for adults. That was a big wake up call for me. I was 16 at the time. And knowing that my peers also didn't realize that wasn't an option for them either. So in regards to that, it took about 8 years. So in 2018, the first round of expungement was passed in legislation. And when it comes to victories where we know we should celebrate things like that, because it's so hard to pass a law anywhere at any time, none of the young people who advocated for expungement qualified. And so New Year's Eve of 2020 made it so that it opened up the door a little bit more for young people. But to me, it still wasn't enough. And a lot of our young people, including myself, thankfully, are finding ways to keep the fire going in our passions and not feel defeated. We understand that those small victories, although may not be something we want to see, we know that there's still work to do. It shows us that we can still get movement, and even though it's a marathon, not a race. The transparency of legislators was also something different that I had witnessed over my years of doing advocacy work, where the leaders of the police reform bill let us know openly, the police union are also organizing to stop the reform from happening. Even in our own backyard, Lowell, Massachusetts, the city councilors mentioned, and they took a vote that racism was not a public health issue. Anyone who knows Lowell, Massachusetts, we have refugees from the Khmer Rouge find home in Lowell. We have Irish immigrants. We have a lot of African immigrants. It's a very diverse city. To see people who are supposed to represent us declare that racism was not a public health issue in the middle of a pandemic, where we are spending days and weeks marching in the streets, and to not see that in your own backyard was very disheartening. To then later on have Lowell City Council again vote that they will back the police because they love them, which is fine. But when you love someone, you hold them accountable for their wrongdoings. They voted to also stop the police reform bill from happening from the state. And with that being said, just recently in the past couple of weeks, after understanding that I also learned the police union are great organizers. They definitely, which is also a misconception, because for us to have had a police reform bill, we had to work with police who wanted to see change in their departments as well. That narrative often isn't shown because it's all done behind closed doors. Within the last couple of weeks, the president of the police union we found out publicly that he's a child molester. And to understand that this was a secret kept from many people, and he was elected as president of the police union, is also disheartening for organizers who put hours and hours and hours throughout their days and nights to push this reform, and to see that these secrets are being held. The Boston Police Department were exposed in a documentary called Trial 4 on Netflix. Sean Ellis is a great organizer as well, who's helping and putting back time into the community for, having rights for people who have felonies to have rights to vote as well. So although there's a lot to celebrate in movement, there is still so much work to do. And sometimes, I get overwhelmed, don't know where to start, but then community is helpful to ground yourself and understand that you're not in it by yourself. Ever since the Chauvin trial started, police has killed 64 people. Ever since the verdict, one more was killed. And, it comes to a point where what does reform really mean? What does it mean to see change, and what does success look like these days? We talk about good cops and bad cops, but I make the example of, there are no good cops. If there are 270 bad cops and there's 30 good cops who do not speak up for the injustices done by their peers, then we now have 300 bad cops. I don't know what else to say to follow that, but I think it's been a solid 6 minutes. I can also answer any questions in the chat, and I'll look at it briefly as well. But just wanted to summarize, this is what we've been dealing with just the past year alone. We're still, the young people in Massachusetts are still pushing every day to ensure there are justices for young people. Young lives are often disregarded, and that's why I do the push to ensure young people are seen and heard, and bringing power to the people, bringing them to spaces that they are not originally invited to.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for the great work that you're doing. It's like that next generation of activism is so important. And as you said, and as Debbie said, it's like we have to keep our feet on the gas. I'd like to call on Martin O'Brien.
It's great to be here with everybody today and on this particular day. The issue of kind of transforming policing is, not unique to one place, and obviously different places differ in the challenges which they face. But in developing this conversation today, Social Change Initiative and Global Citizen Circle felt that it would be helpful to kind of draw on the lessons and experience and learning of two other places that have grappled with the issue of how to secure an effective, fair, human rights respecting, diverse, accountable, legitimate police service. And those issues of policing and community safety. And so we didn't have to look too far in that here in Northern Ireland, where we're based, we've had our own very deep and profound challenges with policing. And then we've also had a long partnership and friendship with colleagues in South Africa.
And just to quickly summarize and pass it back to my colleagues, safety is a fundamental right. And it's important that we put public safety in public hands, right? That race plays a very important role, in what we've seen as misconduct and brutality, and that reform, it's not just about investing in more procedural justice training and de-escalation strategies for law enforcement, but it's also about investing in complementary strategies that are led by impacted people in community. And that when we talk about reform, we must invest in the change. It's not just the conversation, that we have to have the political will, right? As Debbie said, in order to make these things happen. And that we can never take our foot off the gas, because we look away for one moment and power is reorganizing itself to maintain its position. And so thank you all so much for such a lively conversation, and I want to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Akilah. I just want to thank everyone, Debbie, Zelda, Susan, and Akilah. Of course, I also would be remiss if I did not thank Phoebe Delarabidi, who is the Assistant Director for Global Citizen Circle, and for whom we owe so much for organizing and helping to make these circles happen in this virtual setting. So thank you to all of you, but thank you most to all of you who've joined us today and who've listened and learned and taken part in the discussion. And it's a discussion that will continue, and it needs to lead to action for building the safe and just communities that we all want and deserve. Be safe, be well, and onward with optimism.
It sound right, boy.